Look, I only got a few minutes. Hillary doesn't know I snuck out. But I'm here for you. I'm here for Mr. Evans, and I'm here for you, because I care. We're finally to my favorite part of U.S. history, the 90s, when we had a young, handsome president who was there for you. He cared about you, he cared about us, he cared about America. Oh, it was a great time. The internet was fast. The women were fast. What's that? I'm coming, dear. Well, that was a great intro for the 1990s, coffee and U.S. history with Mr. Evans. And today's mug is from Aveiro, Portugal. It's this cute little city that has canals. It's kind of like Venice, only it's in Portugal. And yeah, really, really cool. So, oh my gosh, one of the places I definitely want to travel back to someday. 1992 presidential election is an interesting one because we have three major candidates. We have seen this happen in American history before, but it's not the norm, right? Usually, ever since the Civil War, right, we get a Republican and a Democrat, and they are battling it out. But every once in a while, we get these sort of third-party candidates who rise up and actually take a big chunk of the vote. So in this case, it's a billionaire from Texas, a guy named Ross Perot, who insists that only an outsider, right, somebody who's not part of the political Washington establishment, can come in and run the country properly. Boy, we haven't heard that anywhere recently, have we? Perot is running under what he calls the Reform Party. The Republicans are going to go with the incumbent, George Bush. This is the first George Bush. So if you remember our previous lesson, Bush famously made the quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes," right? And unfortunately for President Bush, he had to go back on that promise. The savings and loan disaster threatened to crash the whole economy. Again, another big idea in U.S. history, right? We saw it in the 1929 stock market crash. We see it more recently in 2007 through 2009, right? Where oftentimes the banks are right in the center of doing really stupid things that threaten to crash the entire economy, right? And the federal government has to step in and do something. And so in this case, Congress had to step in and bail out some of these specific kinds of banks called savings and loans. And so Bush had to go back on his promise of no new taxes. Well, this infuriated a lot of Republicans, right? They didn't want higher taxes. They voted for Bush the first time specifically because they wanted to stick to the Republican platform we talked about in the 1920s, right? Low taxes and low spending. Here we are in the 90s. It's the same thing, right? So there's this little kind of divide going on. And so sort of out of nowhere comes a Democrat, right? And he's from the South. He's governor of the state of Arkansas. And he is going to suddenly rise up and surprise everybody with a chance at winning the presidency. Again, this should remind you of an election in the past. 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft split the Republican vote. And who comes along? Woodrow Wilson, a progressive Democrat from the South, and steals the presidency, right? Well, 1992, some would argue very similar, right? Clinton was somebody not very many people had heard of, but he's young. He goes on MTV and plays his saxophone and kind of appeals to some of the younger voters. He's famously asked if he had ever tried marijuana, and his response is, "When I was in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, but I didn't like it, and I didn't inhale, and I never tried it again." Clinton is going to inherit some foreign policy problems, right? And again, this should remind you of other things we've studied in history. So if you remember, JFK takes over, the CIA has this whole plan involving Cuba that becomes known as the Bay of Pigs. It really wasn't Kennedy's plan. The whole thing was formulated under Eisenhower. The CIA had worked it all out. Kennedy had barely been president when he gives the go-ahead, and it blows up in his face, though, and he's the one who takes all the bad publicity, right? Well, Clinton has something similar. A lot of Americans didn't even realize it, but U.S. soldiers were involved in the country of Somalia in Africa. Somalia was facing horrendous poverty where thousands, maybe millions of people were starving to death. And the United Nations was trying to supply food and aid to these poor people, but the warlords in Somalia were simply stealing all of the stuff. President Bush, in one of his last moves as president, sends in U.S. troops to help support the United Nations to protect these food supplies, right? Well, Clinton takes over, and we have this tragic accident where couple of U.S. Black Hawk helicopters are shot down in the middle of one of these horrible war zones where they're surrounded by thousands of people who are trying to kill them. And unfortunately, there are some American soldiers killed, and the scene is pretty bloody and ugly. And it makes Clinton look bad. Can't talk about Clinton without talking about the scandals. And of course, we've seen this with a lot of our other presidents, both Republican and Democrat. We talked about, Harding cheating on his wife. We know that Kennedy cheated on his wife. And so we've seen this, regularly throughout American history. But a woman named Jennifer Flowers, who worked on Clinton's election campaign, steps forward and said that she had an affair with him for many, many years. Bill Clinton denies it. And it's mostly a he said, she said type thing. But what people have forgotten is the important scandal, the real scandal. Okay, here we go. Look, lost in all of the soap opera cheating affair stuff is something that becomes known as the Whitewater scandal, okay? So I'm going to give you the short version and try to break this down. We're involved in a real estate deal with a couple named the McDougalls. And the idea was they bought all this property in Arkansas that they were then going to turn around and try to sell as vacation property. Or it didn't work. People weren't buying the property. Interest rates were really high at the time. And the company was, set to go bankrupt. Well, somehow the company was given a loan from the state of Arkansas, right? So it was for $300,000, quite a bit of money in this would have been in the late 80s. Eventually, the loan would be called into question, right? Who gave this loan and why? And it all gets traced back. And so there's a controversy surrounding this because if, as president or as governor, Clinton used his political power to get himself a loan that he probably shouldn't have gotten, that would be illegal, right? So, the affair with Jennifer Flowers is not illegal. It's not illegal to have an affair, right? But this Whitewater scandal, this would be a crime. This would be a fraudulent loan, right? Well, obviously there's a big investigation. The Clintons swear that they were silent investment partners in this deal, right? That they gave the money to the McDougalls, but they really didn't know what was going on, and they weren't involved with the day-to-day operations, and so they really had nothing to do with the loan or the bankruptcy or the failed business. It was just, from their standpoint, a bad business adventure, right? Well, the investigators are never able to prove that the Clintons used their political power to achieve this loan, right? So, however, McDougal is sentenced to prison, and she keeps her mouth shut, and of course, eventually, before Bill leaves office, he pardons her, right? As we have seen presidents do throughout history, as we saw Nixon, Bush, and Reagan do on the Republican side, we see the Democrat Clinton, give a pardon to somebody who potentially had information against them, right? All right, so what about Bill's presidency? Well, here we are again with one of my big themes of there's no such thing as it's good for America, right? President Clinton signs into law something called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And it is just what it sounds like. It's a trade agreement between the three countries in North America, Mexico, the US, and Canada. And it basically lowered tariffs and taxes, made it easier for things to be shipped across the borders. It basically made North America one big marketplace, right? Well, economists usually will argue this is a good thing. Free trade is a good thing. And indeed, in the 90s, the economy booms under President Clinton, which is one of the reasons why he's so popular. Again, we've talked about it. If the economy is going good, the president usually gets all the credit. In Clinton's case, the NAFTA agreement was something that was bipartisan. The Republicans and Democrats had both been working on it. It went back to before Clinton was president, but he's the one who signed it into law, and the economy takes off for the most part, right? Now, here's the catch. Like most things, it's good for some people, bad for others. For most of America, NAFTA was a good thing. Here in California, NAFTA probably really helped our economy, right? Why? It lowered taxes. It made things cheaper to buy. It made it easier to ship things across the border. So in a state like California, where we don't manufacture a lot, we don't have a lot of factories, right? It was good because it meant most of us who are consumers were buying things cheap. However, the downside to this is it also enabled or encouraged a lot of companies who had factories in the US to close down these factories and move them to Mexico, right? Where the land is cheaper and the labor is cheaper, the all-around costs are probably cheaper, right? So certain parts of the United States, right? Places where there were a lot of factories, where Americans were still making things, right, with their hands, right, where they were going to work and making products, right? A lot of those factories were closed down after NAFTA and moved to Mexico or other parts of the world, right? And those jobs have never come back, right? So it was good. Most economists would say, look, it was good for most of the country and most people. But I have relatives in Wisconsin, and they think of NAFTA as a horrible, dirty word, and I don't blame them, right? Because in their town, in their county, right, this hurt their economy, and in some of the smaller towns, they've never really recovered from it. These are the kinds of arguments, right, we have to make as a country all the time. And we were making these kind of arguments in the 1920s, we were making them in the 1990s, and we'll be making them in the 2020s, right? The second Clinton sex scandal involves a woman named Paula Jones. Paula accused the president of sexually harassing her way back when he was governor of Arkansas, right? So this is a civil suit, right? She's not pressing criminal charges. She believes he's ruined her reputation and that therefore she should be compensated financially, money-wise, right? During the civil trial, then, of course, the investigators are looking for other women Clinton may have had an affair with, right? The more women he's had an affair with, the more evidence they feel like it provides their case that he did sexually harass Paula Jones. So throughout the course of this civil suit, it is rumored that Clinton has also had an affair with an intern at the White House named Monica Lewinsky, right? So the president now is forced in part of the civil suit, right, to go forward and testify. Now he's under oath. And so legally now he has to tell the truth. And he's asked about Monica Lewinsky, and President Clinton famously says, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." So look, he denies it. And it turns out that Monica, this whole time, has been chatting with her best friend. She's doing what girls do. She goes to lunch with her best friend, her BFF, Linda Tripp, and she tells Linda all about how wonderful the president is and all about their sexual life together, right? And her BFF, Linda Tripp, has been recording the whole thing on a conversation. Yes, this is worse than any reality TV show you've ever seen, right? Tripp then hands over the tape to the special prosecutor and says, look, here's your proof. He is having an affair with Monica Lewinsky. Now they can get a search warrant. They go through Monica's closet, find some clothes, find some more evidence. I won't go into detail. You're going to have to Google that one. But they now have the proof, right? What do they have proof of? Well, they have proof he's had an affair. Again, that's not a crime. But they also now have proof that the president has lied under oath. This is called perjury, and it is a crime, right? Once you go in a courtroom and promise to tell the truth and all that, you cannot lie. The Republicans in Congress decide that the president has committed a crime and therefore should be impeached, right? He should be removed from office, right? So at this point in American history, only one president had ever been impeached, Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. Nixon, as you know, was likely to be impeached, but resigned before Congress had a chance to impeach him, becoming the only president who ever did that, who quit early. But Clinton is now going to become the second U.S. president to be impeached, right? The impeachment is the trial. The House acts as the prosecuting attorney, tries to present their evidence, their case, right? The Senate then votes. The Senate acts like the jury, and the Senate votes. And if 2/3 of the Senate agree that the president has committed a crime, then they can remove him from office. It takes a 2/3 vote. The argument then, and here's where, as brilliant as our Constitution is, it is a little vague at times, right? And this is one of those rare cases, right? The Constitution says you can impeach and remove a president for high crimes and misdemeanors, right? So the argument at this point becomes, was perjury a high crime or misdemeanor? And for many of the Republicans, especially, they said, yes, it is. We can't trust him to be our leader anymore. We should remove him from office, right? A lot of Democrats said, whoa, wait a minute. What he did was wrong, but it doesn't count as a high crime or misdemeanor. They were talking about things like treason or conspiracy or bribery. He lied about an affair. It's not that big a deal. It's like, getting a speeding ticket. Yeah, he should be punished, but he shouldn't be removed from office as president, right? The punishment doesn't fit the crime in this case, right? Well, predictably, the vote went along party lines. And so there were 50 people who voted guilty. They were all Republicans, right? 45 Democrats and 5 Republicans voted not guilty. So the vote was 50-50 in the Senate, and they had to get 2/3, which would have required 67. So it wasn't really that close. He survives the impeachment pretty easily. Now, something that many of your textbooks, especially if they're not new, would leave out, right? So let's drop some more truth bombs. Okay, so 2 of the Republicans leading the charge were Dennis Hastert and Newt Gingrich, both saying Clinton should be impeached because of how immoral he was. Gingrich married his high school geometry teacher when he was 19 because he got her pregnant. And this conveniently got Gingrich out of the Vietnam War, right? He eventually divorced this first wife and married a second time, then divorced the second wife and married a third time. And we now know, while Gingrich was dating one of these mistresses during the Clinton-Lewinsky adultery scandal, as he was proclaiming family values, he was paying for an apartment, kind of like President Harding, right? He was paying for a place for his mistress on the side, right? So look, none of that was illegal, but it certainly paints a bit of a hypocrisy, I think, to call out the president for having an affair and being immoral. You know, when you've lived this lifestyle, far worse is Dennis Hastert. Hastert, it turned out, had molested at least 5 teenage boys while he was a high school wrestling coach. And the only reason it came to light was he was bribing one of the boys, who was now a man, to keep quiet about it. And so he was illegally funneling millions of dollars that were supposed to go for his political campaigns, right, to bribing this person to not tell. And of course, when investigators discovered the money and found out, you know, this money was missing illegally, this person came forward, and then 4 more people came forward. And so Hastert was convicted. He was sentenced to prison, right, for being a child molester. Look, we've seen a lot of corruption on both the Democratic and Republican sides. And a lot of times, you know, these people who are acting like they are so high and mighty are, you know, the worst ones of all, right? So people in glass houses shouldn't throw rocks. Thank you for being with me on Coffee and U.S. History in the Kitchen with Mr. Evans.